The night was cold, sharp, and heavy with silence. December 23rd, 1976. Memphis lay wrapped in winter's chill, the streets lit by a scatter of Christmas lights that flickered against the damp pavement. For most, the season meant warmth, family, and the joy of gathering. But inside a black Cadillac gliding through familiar streets, Elvis Presley felt none of that. The king of rock and roll, adored by millions, sat behind the wheel burdened by a loneliness that fame could never erase. The weight of the year, its storms of illness, scandal, and private despair pressed down on him, leaving even the beauty of Beale Street's decorations unable to pierce his melancholy. There is a story often told about that night. Some say Elvis came face to face with a woman from his childhood, a woman who once cared for him when his family struggled. While not every detail can be historically verified, the tale carries a truth that is impossible to deny. Elvis Presley's heart was never far from the people who had once lifted him. Whether this story has been shaped by memory, retelling, or legend, its lesson reflects what countless witnesses knew to be real: Elvis's compassion and his unwillingness to forget the kindness shown to him as a boy. As the traffic light turned red at Union Avenue, the image of a frail woman huddled in a doorway caught his eye. Something about her stopped him. It was not just pity, it was recognition. Her eyes, though dimmed by hardship, carried a familiarity that reached through time and memory.
Elvis?
A whisper rose from his own heart before he spoke aloud, barely daring to believe. Miss Ruby. In that instant, the world seemed to fold in on itself. Memories of his childhood, lonely nights, hungry mornings, and a kind soul who had once been his guardian angel flooded back. What unfolded in this story is not only about recognition, but about something larger: a man rediscovering his purpose, and a reminder that the greatest legacies are not written in applause but in compassion. Elvis Presley was no stranger to contradiction. To the world he was the king, the man who had electrified stages, broken records, and defined generations with the swing of his hips and the thunder of his voice. But behind the glitter of Graceland and the roar of adoring crowds, there lived a man worn thin by battles that no spotlight could illuminate. By late 1976, those contradictions had become unbearable. He carried the exhaustion of relentless touring, the frailty of a body strained by illness, and the hollow ache of a soul weary of being seen as an icon while feeling invisible as a man. Every smile he gave to fans was real, but it often masked a loneliness that fame only magnified. The more the world adored him, the more he felt that something was missing. He had wealth, yes, and a mansion filled with possessions, but the simple things, the grounding comfort of trust, the ease of companionship unclouded by expectation, were slipping further away. Nights were often sleepless, haunted by the silence of Graceland's halls. The pressure to remain Elvis Presley weighed like armor he could not take off, leaving him yearning for moments when he could just be a son, a father, or even just a man named Elvis from Tupelo. That December evening, as he drove through Memphis, the city was both familiar and distant. These were the streets where he had once run barefoot, as a boy, chasing dreams too big for his pocket but never too big for his heart. He knew poverty's sting intimately. The fear of eviction, the hunger that gnawed at the stomach, the quiet humiliation of being overlooked. It was this memory, embedded in him like a scar, that made the sight of the woman in the doorway impossible to ignore. When he recognized her face, Miss Ruby, the contrast between his present and his past hit him with staggering force. He had known hunger, and she had fed him. He had known fear, and she had comforted him. She had been a steady presence when his parents, Vernon and Gladys, struggled to make ends meet. A young African-American woman in her 20s, Ruby had little of her own, yet she had poured what she had into a small boy with big eyes and bigger dreams. She had been a shield against the uncertainty of his childhood, and her kindness had stitched itself permanently into his memory. Now, decades later, to find her in rags on a cold December street was almost too much to bear. Elvis felt a rush of guilt. How could someone who had given so much be left with nothing? How could a world that celebrated him so lavishly abandon the woman who once safeguarded his innocence? He thought of the applause that followed him everywhere and realized how hollow it sounded compared to the silence surrounding Ruby's plight. The memory of her words came back to him. Family isn't always blood. Family is who takes care of you, who never lets you feel alone. She had said that countless nights when he was young, curled up against shadows that frightened him, and now those words echoed louder than ever. Elvis understood in that moment that what he owed Ruby was not charity, it was family. In that dimly lit doorway, his fame, his wealth, his struggles, all of it fell away. What remained was a boy who had once needed someone, standing before the very woman who had answered that need. And in recognizing her, he recognized something deeper within himself, a longing to be more than a performer, more than an idol, a longing to be a man who remembered, who gave back, who carried forward the lessons of love that had shaped him. The night air cut against Elvis's skin as he stepped out of the Cadillac, his boots crunching softly against the icy pavement. Each breath rose invisible clouds, but the chill he felt came from something deeper than the winter wind. It was the sight of Ruby, frail and hunched, her body nearly swallowed by ragged layers of fabric. For a moment he stood frozen, caught between disbelief and heartbreak. The noise of passing cars faded, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. "Miss Ruby." His voice trembled, carrying both shock and a tender reverence. Slowly, her head lifted, her eyes, tired and blurred with years of hardship, blinked against the light. Then recognition dawned, fragile at first, then certain. "Elvis," she whispered, her voice cracked and thin. "My sweet boy, Elvis Presley." The sound of her voice pulled him back in time. He could see himself as a small boy curled under a blanket, while Ruby hummed lullabies to chase away nightmares. He could smell cornbread baking in her tiny kitchen, feel her hand smoothing his hair when the world felt too big. That memory collided with the present reality. Ruby shivering on a cold street, forgotten by everyone but him. Elvis knelt down beside her, ignoring the sting of the icy ground. "Miss Ruby, what happened? How did you end up here?" His words rushed out, thick with sorrow. Ruby tried to smile, though tears spilled down her cheeks. "Life happened, child. Worked for families, raised other people's little ones, just as I did for you. Saved enough for a little house. Thought I was doing all right. Then sickness came. The doctors said my heart was weak. Couldn't keep up the work. Bills piled higher than I could climb. Lost the house. Lost near everything. Some nights a shelter takes me in. Tonight it was full." She gestured weakly to the concrete around her. "So here I am." Her voice wavered between pride and shame. She spoke of decades given to caring for others, only to be left alone when her own strength failed. To Elvis, every word struck like a blow. He thought of all the times she had sacrificed, feeding him when she barely had enough for herself, soothing his fears without asking for anything in return. And now, in her hour of need, society had turned its back. Elvis swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You should not be here, Miss Ruby. Not you." His hands, trembling, reached for hers. They were cold, frail, yet familiar. "You once told me family means not giving up on each other. That's what you said. Well, you are my family. You always have been, and I will not leave you like this." Ruby shook her head gently. "You Sip's got your own troubles, son. I read the papers. I know you Sip's not well yourself. I can sit be a burden on you." Her words cut deep, because they were true. He was not well. His health was slipping, his spirit weary. But in that very moment he realized something profound. Helping her was not a burden, it was a purpose. Elvis leaned closer, his voice steady now. "Miss Ruby, you gave me love when I had nothing. You gave me safety when the world was cold. If I do nothing else in this life, I will give that back to you. That is not charity, it is gratitude." A silence settled between them, filled with more weight than words could hold. Then Ruby, through tears, whispered, "You always had the kindest heart, Elvis. I prayed you would never forget where you came from." "I never did," he answered softly, rising to his feet and gently helping her up, "and I never will." As he guided her to the warmth of his Cadillac, the world outside seemed to blur. The noise of cars, the distant laughter of holiday revelers, the glow of neon lights, all of it faded. What remained was a simple truth. This night was not about Elvis the performer. It was about Elvis the man, returning to a debt of love that had been waiting to be repaid. The Cadillac's heater hummed softly as Elvis steered toward Baptist Memorial Hospital. Ruby sat in the passenger seat, her frail body bundled in his jacket, her eyes darting between exhaustion and disbelief. She had once carried him with the strength of her care. Now he carried her not in arms but in resolve. For the first time that year, Elvis felt clarity cut through the fog that had been suffocating him. "Miss Ruby," he said gently, as the city lights streaked past, "do you remember what you told me when I was a boy, when I was scared of the dark?" Ruby Sipt's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I told you light doesn't set, come from lamps or the moon, Elvis. It comes from people who care about you. That set's what keeps the darkness away." Her words struck him like gospel, not just remembered but renewed. He had sung to millions, yet how often had he truly cared beyond the performance? He thought of the screaming audiences, the sold-out stadiums, the endless merchandise, all of it grand but somehow hollow. In Ruby's words, he realized his truest calling was not to be idolized but to be human, to reach for connection deeper than applause. At the hospital, Elvis lifted Ruby into his arms and carried her through the entrance. Gasps rippled through the staff. Elvis Presley, the most famous man in America, carrying an elderly woman as though she were the only person in the world. He did not pause for recognition, did not glance at the curious eyes. "She needs help," he said firmly, his voice breaking through their awe. Now. Doctors rushed her to treatment, but Elvis did not leave. He paced the waiting room, replaying every moment of their reunion. His mind wrestled with more than her condition. It wrestled with the question she had awakened in him. What good is all this fame if it does not lift others with me? Hours passed before a nurse assured him that Ruby was stable. Relief washed over him, but it was joined by something else. Resolve, sitting alone in the sterile waiting room, Elvis leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. For years he had searched for meaning in the whirlwind of his career. When Ruby woke, he was there by her side. She reached for his hand, whispering, "You shouldn't waste your time here, child. The world needs you." Elvis shook his head, tears glistening. "The world may need my songs, Miss Ruby, but you are the reason I sing them. Music isn't set about stages or charts. It's set about this, about making sure nobody feels forgotten, about turning loneliness into hope." Ruby Sipt's eyes filled with tears. "Then you found the truth, Elvis. Fame fades, but kindness that sips forever." In that room, Elvis's turning point crystallized. He was not just a singer, not just a performer. He was a vessel for something greater, a messenger of empathy, a bridge between hearts. For years he had carried the weight of being the king. Now he understood that the crown meant little compared to the responsibility of compassion. The man who once sought to conquer stages now sought to heal souls. It was not an epiphany born of spotlight or applause, but of a quiet exchange between two souls bound by love and memory. Ruby had once been his light in the dark. Now she had shown him how to become a light for others. That realization was his true music. In the days that followed, Elvis's promise to Ruby became more than a vow. It became a mission. While doctors tended to her heart and lungs, he began making phone calls, pulling strings, and setting plans into motion. Elvis was not a man who did things halfway. When his heart was stirred, his entire being followed. The first step was Ruby herself. Elvis arranged for her bills to be covered, her nutrition restored, her comfort secured. But even as he sat by her bedside, holding her hand through long nights, he knew this was bigger than one act of kindness. If Ruby could be forgotten, he thought, how many others are out there, hidden in the shadows of this city, carrying stories nobody hears? Graceland's phones buzzed with activity as Elvis directed his staff to identify elderly men and women in Memphis who were facing poverty, sickness, or abandonment. Quietly, without press releases or cameras, he began purchasing homes, paying medical expenses, delivering food, and restoring dignity to people who thought the world had left them behind. When friends asked why, he gave only a simple answer: because someone once did it for me. For Ruby, he bought a modest but beautiful house in a safe neighborhood, furnished with warmth and designed for comfort. Nurses were hired to check on her daily, but what mattered most to her was Elvis's presence. He visited often, sometimes carrying groceries himself, other times simply sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, listening to her stories. To neighbors, it was astonishing. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, sitting humbly in an elderly woman's home, as if it were the most natural place to be. But for Elvis, it was no performance. It was family. The press eventually caught wind of his quiet efforts, though Elvis had never intended it. By his 42nd birthday in January 1977, the story spread across newspapers. Elvis Presley had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to lift the elderly and forgotten of Memphis. Yet what captured hearts was not the money, it was the image of him sitting at Ruby's side, laughing softly as if no time had passed since he was a boy in her care. For Elvis, the impact was personal. His music began to carry a different weight. Songs he had sung for years now rang with deeper conviction, as though the words had been carved into him through lived truth. When he stood on stage, he no longer sang only for applause. He sang for Ruby, for those who had no voice, for anyone who needed to know they were not alone. This transformation extended beyond music. Friends noticed he grew more patient, more tender, especially with those who were vulnerable. Family saw a man whose fame no longer consumed him, but whose compassion defined him. Helping Ruby gave me something my career never could, he confided to a close friend. It gave me peace. It reminded me why God gave me this gift in the first place. Ruby herself became a symbol of that change. She often told reporters that Elvis had not just given her a home, he had given her back her dignity. He didn't look at me and see charity, she said. He looked at me and saw family. In a world that often measured greatness by wealth or applause, Elvis had discovered another kind of greatness, the quiet kind born not of crowns or stages, but of remembering where you came from and choosing to lift others with you. Looking back, it is clear that what happened on that cold December night in 1976 was more than chance. It was destiny in story form. Some details may have blurred between history and legend, but the truth of Elvis Presley's heart shines through regardless. In Ruby's weary eyes, as the story is told, he saw not only the woman who had once sheltered him from fear, but also the truth of his own calling. For years Elvis had searched for meaning amid the noise of celebrity, and in this tale he found it. Music was not just entertainment, it was medicine. His songs were not meant only to fill concert halls, but to heal loneliness, to bridge divides, to remind people they mattered. Whether this exact encounter unfolded exactly as described or not, the deeper message is timeless. Elvis believed in compassion, in gratitude, and in the dignity of every soul. The story of Elvis and Ruby lives on not just in retellings but in the countless documented acts of generosity he left behind. He gave homes, cars, food, and medical support to strangers and friends alike, often without recognition. And he did it because he remembered what it felt like to be poor, to be scared, to need someone. When Elvis died only months later, those who knew him best carried forward that truth. His legacy was not only measured in records sold, but in lives touched, in dignity restored, in kindness shared. And so, the lesson he left us with is simple but profound. Greatness is not found in applause, but in compassion. Fame fades, but kindness endures. As you sit with this story, ask yourself who once gave you light in the dark, and whose darkness can you help lift today? Whether legend, fact, or a blending of both, the story of Elvis and Ruby remains powerful because it carries a truth about all of us. The greatest music we make is the kind that plays in another person's heart.